Operator Syndrome, episode 48. 48, closing in on 50. Magical number 50. Nothing will happen at 50, I don't think. Um, but it'll be nice to hit that marker. Today, we're actually getting back into some book reviews here coming up, I think. So, for today and the next episode following this, I think we're going to be talking about War by Sebastian Junger, right? Is that the name?
Correct.
And maybe weaving in there the documentary Restrepo, which aligns with the book well. And Steve, what's that other? What's Tim Hetherington's?
Yeah, it's called Infidel. It's taken from a tattoo a lot of the guys got on their chest. And it's a pictorial. It's Hetherington is a photojournalist, and he went through. It's really worth the price just for these photos of these guys. Um, and one gentleman, Elliot Alcantara, who Patrick went through. Did you go through Ranger School with him?
Yeah, we were stuck in the gulag together. Yeah,
Oh, right. Okay. He seems like a colorful character, but a badass,
yeah,
like all
definitely.
Rangers.
That's right. That's true.
Yeah.
So we're going to be doing that now, and then we'll be doing another book review here in a second, but we'll talk about that next time. So I'm going to cut it to Steve, and Steve, your thoughts on War and Restrepo. What are your initial impressions, from your perspective?
Yeah. Well, it's a great book. I read it, I think around 2010, 11 when it came out. And I reread it just last couple of weeks just because I wanted it to be fresh and I knew we were going to be talking about it. I loved it for a lot of reasons. Well, loved it. I loved part of it and I hated part of it. Not that it wasn't well written, but of the suffering that these guys went through, which we'll get into. Um, so it was written by Sebastian Junger. He was also well known for a book which became a movie called The Perfect Storm. He's a journalist. I think he's freelance, but he was working for Vanity Fair and National Geographic, who were underwriting his project that this book was the result of, alongside a British photojournalist named Tim Hetherington, who did the filming. And man, those guys, they got shot at. They were embedded with those guys, and I mean, the footage is pretty hairy. Some of it. I mean, they're right there taking rounds. They were unarmed, but they had body armor. But yeah, so the book, uh, the book, I was thinking about how would I class this book. It was almost a case study, almost like
Mm,
what anthropologists call an ethnography, where you go in and live with people and you just observe and ask questions if you speak the language, which he did, obviously, and get to know the conditions and the lifestyle of these people. And so, on a broad level, I think it's a great deep dive into one particular unit, which we'll talk about. And I just preface it by saying this gets into a lot of what Patrick and I kind of have an eye toward with operator syndrome. To start with, the guys that we'll talk about, the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Well, they're part of the Airborne Brigade, 173rd Airborne Brigade, and this particular company called Battle Company was the group of men serving there. Now, I just want to say I looked up again today. It does look like we're starting to go down in veteran suicides a little bit. We're not by any means where I think anybody would hope to be, but there's still something like 17 suicides per day of veterans, and a lot of that is based on what these guys saw. I thought I might read this portion from the very end of the book, and then we can backpedal into their situation. And sometimes I think it's interesting to just look at what came out and of how messed up these guys are. Now, I want to just say this, man. I salute all of these soldiers. They are phenomenal heroes, and they took more combat than most special ops operators that I've ever known. I mean, they're the firefights are so intense, and sometimes multiple firefights every day, right? So, and we'll get into the scenario and the context, but they were exposed to so much and lost guys. They had heavy casualties. The movie Restrepo is named after one of their medics, Juan Restrepo, who was killed, and it was it was about an outpost that they had to secure on the high ground overlooking the COP, where the headquarters element was for Battle Company, because they were taking fire almost every day from these different angles up in these mountains. So they named it Restrepo after Juan Restrepo, who was killed, and a really beloved, larger than life guy that everybody loved, and just a great guy. So the 173rd, as I understand, kind of their garrison headquarters is in Vicenza, Italy. That's where they're stationed, and then of course they deployed over to the Korengal Valley in Afghanistan. But after they got back, after all of this was over, there's a couple blurbs I wanted to read. One about just how messed up these guys are. And these are some of the toughest guys you can. They're tough as nails. They don't get any tougher, right? And it said the toughest guys in the platoon. This is back when they're back in Italy. The toughest guys in the platoon find themselves crying every day, and the more vulnerable guys skirt the edge of sanity. It's even bothering me, Bobby confides to me over dinner, and nothing bothers me. Can you imagine what it's doing to some of the other guys? And I thought, so that just shows their psychological condition after having so much intense combat. It's the product of combat. I mean, love it or hate it, it's what it does. It's just, there's no way around it. So there's another colorful character named O'Byrne, and he's a tough dude. He comes from a really rough family background. His dad actually shot him.
That's right.
Yeah, he was in and out of jail. But the Army kind of turned his life around. And so anyway, this talks about O'Byrne and the insanity of the military bureaucracy, which just makes you want to shoot yourself. He said he finally shows up the next day, and Navala drives him around the base trying to take care of his paperwork. I tag along to see what happens. O'Byrne refers to the base as Coward's Land because it's a place where guys who have never done anything but fill out paperwork can boss around guys who have actually fought for their country. A whole new set of rules apply that seem almost deliberately punitive of the traits that make for a good combat soldier. We park in front of something called the transition office, and O'Byrne says, "Come in and watch. This is going to be good." He's in a catch-22 where his military ID is going to expire in a couple days. So then he's going to be in this weird limbo where he can't get a flight home, and he can't get on base. He's stuck, right? There's a middle-aged lady behind the desk who seems perfectly nice. O'Byrne takes a mint out of a jar on her desk and gives her one and explains that his paperwork is late and his ID expires in 2 days. By then, he's supposed to be on a plane home. She says, "The only acceptable reason for not being on that plane is if you're in jail," the woman says. "And if you're not on that plane, you'll be arrested and put in jail." O'Byrne maintains his composure. "So what should I do?" he asks. "Call your commanding officer," the woman says, "and ask him to have you arrested. That way you won't be breaking the rules when you don't get on the plane." If she understands the irony at work here, she doesn't betray it. "Let me get this right," O'Byrne says. "You want me to get arrested now so I won't get arrested later?" "That's right," the woman says, and returns to her paperwork. We get up to go, and O'Byrne turns to me as we walk out the door. "See," he says, "see why I hate the Army?" I thought it's humorous, but it's also kind of tragic at the same time.
Yeah, it is catch-22. I think I've said that before on this
catch
thing,
20. Yeah.
But and not just the idea. It is a catch-22, right? In the sense, but also the just absurdity of military logic.
Yeah,
Like just the way things work in that book, Catch-22. I remember liking it as just a teenager reading it in high school, but as an adult rereading it, it's just like, wow. At the time, you thought, when I was in high school, I thought, this is funny. This is funny, tragic, like you said, but also it can't really be like that, right? Like maybe it was a caricature, but no, you reread it after you've been in the military, and you're like, no, it's exactly like people can't comprehend how much like this it actually is.
Yeah,
It's wild.
it's insane. You see it on so many levels. We when we were in the Gulf War, we did some swimming in across the beach, and one of the secondary weapons I would choose to carry is a stainless 357 Magnum revolver because they don't jam. I mean, you still got to make sure there's not sand in them, but it's really a lot simpler mechanism than an semi-automatic pistol. And They only issued us 38 special ammo because that's all the supply chain would you couldn't order any 357 Magnum, which is a lot more powerful than 38 for those who may not know. And so we bought our own civilian 357 Magnum. It was some really high performance bullets because that's what you want. And it was us all. We always would ask our lieutenant, well, why can't we get this ammo? And he goes, it's just not in the supply system. We're just like, this is really crazy. So stuff like that you're like, well, if you feel like you can't even do your job that they're asking you to do, and a lot of times it is the case. But yeah, so it's one of those things you pull your hair out, and if you know, for these poor guys, it just, like I said, utter heroes, just being shot at and wounded, and just a nightmare. And we'll get into some of that. That, you know, for them to have burn one of them was, yeah, some military person who was not a combatant person at all was screaming at one of them to sit properly in his chair, like after they got back and they were in a chow hall or something. But just stuff like that. So this is the story, war of about a year of this group, 173rd Airborne. Hats off to you guys, an elite unit. A lot of them went on back to Ranger Regiment. I found out in a follow-up film, and there is a follow-up film called Korengal, which is a part 2 to Restrepo. But they were situated in a valley in Afghanistan called the Korengal Valley. It is the single most dangerous and difficult part of Afghanistan. I was looking up some history on it, and the Russians back in the late 70s, early 80s couldn't do anything in there, and went home with their tails between their legs because it's always just been a hotbed of militancy. Older back in that day, when I was in high school, it was the Mujahideen, but they were the same stock of people, very hardy, very poor, but capable fighters. I mean, no joke fighters, hard men. So they were sent to this valley. It's in Kunar province, which is northeastern Afghanistan, almost to Pakistan. Pakistan's like one ridge over, seriously. So it's like right in this weird area. A lot of arms going back and forth from Pakistan to Afghanistan and so forth. And also of note, I made a note to myself that one valley over from the Korengal is where a 4-man SEAL recon team was obliterated. They made a movie about it, which I won't get into that, but it was the result of a book called Lone Survivor. Marcus Luttrell, the one out of the 4 who made it home, and they got dropped in to get this guy Ahmad Shah, who was a terrorist, Al Qaeda member, and he had killed a bunch of U.S. forces, and found out that it was a setup from the start. Basically, the movie paints it kind of differently. That there's these random goat herds just stumbled across these guys. Well, they sent those goat herds out on recons every day, and they'd have radios with them. The guy had a radio with him, and but they don't send them out armed because we can't shoot if they're armed because of the laws of armed conflict. Anyway, that led to the downing of a CH-47 QRF trying to come in and rescue him, which killed everybody on board, all the Army crew, the Night Stalker crew, and a whole SEAL. I believe it was it was at least a squad, might have been a platoon, trying to rescue these guys that were getting shot to pieces. And there were several hundred Taliban versus 4 guys. So you look back on it and it's just like, yeah. But I just say that because some people might cross-reference that. That was known as Operation Red Wings. It was a Navy, mostly Navy operation. Well, Navy Army, or it was a joint operation because of the platforms. So anyway, very, very nasty area of fighting, very committed combat troops, and the life of these guys who now battle company is the larger group, but this one platoon went up into I think it was second platoon, went up onto this hill to try to build this outpost called Restrepo, and they took most of the most severe fighting like day in and day out. So I guess I'll give some breathing room to Patrick here.
I no, that's it, and it's about their experiences there, and I think what the book does so well is to capture the human perspective, you know,
Yeah.
because these guys were in a really tough position. Uh, I don't envy what they had to do. I mean, they were put in the worst valley in Afghanistan, uh, and put into some of the worst positions, like geographic positions possible, and they just had to sit there and take it. You
Yeah.
know, that's what they were doing there. They, it was from reading the book and watching Restrepo, they did do offensive operations, but they spent a lot of time just defending themselves, and they built out these cops and OPs, and you can't move that stuff easily, right?
No.
So they know, so the enemy knows exactly where you are, and they can try different things, and they can just and one of the things I remember picking up on when as I was rereading it was just the harassment, right?
No.
So they don't have to the enemy didn't need to full on attack the OP or the cop. They just needed to harass it a little bit, and it costs the enemy nothing to do. Basically, usually nothing to do that,
Yeah.
but for the psyche of the paratroopers, hunkered down. That's a big effect, and so it's and knowing how Afghanistan turned out in the end makes it even harder to read and watch, what we put those guys through. Um, so yeah, again, hats off to them. I wouldn't want to do it. You couldn't. I mean, that was for us, for me. That was what they went through. That was the punishment,
Hmm.
right? It's like, hey, do you want to get kicked out and sent on a 15-month deployment to sit in an OP and just get, drilled by enemy fire constantly? It's like, no, no, I really don't want to do I don't want to do that. I wouldn't want to be that person. Same way I wouldn't want to be, in a convoy in Baghdad, running supplies. Like I'd prefer to be offensive. I prefer to work when we have advantages. That's what I want to do. And so these guys and I met and I've got nothing but respect for those guys. You mentioned one guy, I was in the gulag with him. He was a nice guy, great tattoos.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and actually, and I can't remember his name, but one of the PLs, I don't know what platoon leaders, the
Hmm.
officer in charge of the platoon, one of them was in the squad that I graduated with. I couldn't remember his name, still can't, but I remember seeing him in the movie Restrepo. I was like, holy shit, that dude was in my squad, and he was a nice guy.
Yeah.
And actually, this happened right after we graduated. So these poor guys got through, made it through Ranger School, and then this was their next deployment. This was their follow up deployment. I don't know how soon afterwards it was. Um, like, did they catch that whole deployment? Did they meet halfway? I'm not quite sure how that worked, but that's rough.
Yeah.
That's rough to think about. Um, so yeah,
Yeah. It's also insane. I mean, this the troops are heroes. The big leaders and their policy planning and the politics of it all, I'm very leery of. Um, I just you're putting our men in an unwinnable situation. Like literally, we pulled out of there. I mean, well, we pulled out of all Afghanistan, obviously, but
Mm-hmm.
you know that does tremendous moral injury to soldiers who've watched some of their best friends and brothers get killed right beside them. They've got to live with now why, and why am I so screwed up for the rest of my life? I can't sleep. I'm on meds. You name it. I can't count how many of them said they couldn't sleep anymore. They were just having real trouble sleeping. Or if they did sleep, they'd wake up in a cold sweat and a firefight.
I mean, what they experienced was the closest thing we had in modern times to like trench warfare,
Yeah.
right? So they're in cops and OPs,
Yeah.
they're dug in, and they're just, just taking fire constantly.
Yeah.
It's the closest thing I had to like World War One style until the Ukraine invasion, where there was like
Yeah.
literal trench warfare and all the kinds of crazy stuff that came about with that. But for Americans, that's like the closest thing. And I've always said, if there was one war that I definitely wouldn't, if you had to transport me to some other war, if there was one where I would like cross off the list, if I only got one choice, it would be World War One. That would be the one where that any other one, they all suck, but that would be the one I definitely didn't want to get sent to.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, just saying, well, if you had more to say, I was going to go off and talk about the kind of insanity of it because they're trying they were trying in the valley, they're they were trying to convince these elders, these tribal elders, to hey, help work with us, give us information. In return, we're going to give you humanitarian aid, we're going to improve the roads, we're going to make life better for you. But it was so many conflicts. Like, for example, they went out on this one operation called Rock Avalanche, and it was one of their worst losses of battle company. Um, they there was actually a worse situation with a group called Chosen Company, who were further up the valley. They got torn apart, lost even more. But their goal is to go in this area where they're going. There was an offensive patrol through. I wouldn't even call it a village; just these houses built on the sides of hills. And they knew they were going to this area, and Captain Kearney, who was the commander of the company, said. He said, "No shit. When we cross this one grid line, we take fire every time we get ambushed." And they were supposed to push into that area to try to keep the Taliban fighters on their heels. And they were going through this town, and they called in. I don't know if it was warthogs or Apaches, but they were called in some gunships. Ended up killing, I think, one or two civilians and hurting a number of children. I mean, clearly not combatants. And the elders were just like, "What do you want us to do?" I mean, there's no cooperation at all. And one of the elders called for full on jihad because of the civilian casualties. So it's just like I'm just kind of rubbing my head, going, "What on earth, man?" You talk about setting guys up for failure. Makes my blood boil for the soldiers. But anyway, yeah, an impossible mission, really.
Yeah. Sent there to try to provide security so that way we could, like you said, improve the lives of the people there. The people there didn't want their lives improved, at
Right.
least not by us, or by the way the coalition forces would have liked to have improved their lives. So what do? I guess you just hang these guys out in the meat grinder until the people relent to be saved. To be saved, how else? How else can you interpret it?
Right.
Um, it was it's tough. It's a lot to ask of paratroopers, infantrymen. That's not really their job. That's not what we train for. That's but they performed very admirably. What one thing I was going to say was, you mentioned some of the guys who went to the Ranger Regiment afterward. Well, Osland, I think he's Lieutenant Colonel Osland in that. I think he got out as a colonel. He was actually an enlisted ranger back in the day. He's like an old school enlisted ranger guy.
Uh-huh.
And he's one of the guys that came back. I was still in the regiment when these guys came over. So Osland came over, and I think he came over as deputy regimental commander. So we have like our RCO regimental commanding officer who's in charge of the regiment, the three Ranger battalions at the time.
Mhm.
And I think Osland was the deputy then. Um, I don't know if he must have had like company, platoon, or company or battalion command in the regiment before, because I think I mentioned this before. Officers have to go back out into the conventional army and then come back in. So whatever job they're gonna do most of the time, and again, back in my day, but the jobs that they want to do in the regiment, they have to have done it somewhere else first. And more often than not, where these officers go are to the airborne units, just because that kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So our officers, a brand new PL, well, first they got to be a PL, and they're probably a PL in the 82nd or the 173rd, right? So
Right.
PL's there, they do time, they perform well, then they go to the selection, they get selected, and then they become a PL in the Rangers, the regiment. Um, and they're always like one rank up. So like a PL is like a lieutenant, but our PLs at our time were always captains. Kearney was doing his company command at the 173rd there during this time, and then he came over to third bat, and he was like A or C co. He didn't come to B co, A or C co. But I remember when he was Major Kearney then,
Hmm.
and he was a company commander in the battalion I was in, and so. Um, in terms of the enlisted guys, I don't know how many, if any. I would honestly be surprised if any enlisted guys came over to the Ranger Regiment after that. But for the officers, absolutely, they would have done their time and came over. Especially since now, when I read the book, I was like, oh, there's a connection there, right? So Osland brought his boy Kearney over.
Yeah.
Let me rephrase that. I'm sure Kearney
Yeah. Yeah.
more than earned his spot. But it doesn't hurt when
Right. You
you
got
know
connections, so you're
it
going to
doesn't
use
hurt, which is a very army thing. The army is very small. That those type of connections, the army is really known for that. So it helps. And I never heard anything bad about Osland or Kearney.
it. Yeah.
But I was very surprised to see them because I had gotten out by the time I think most of this blew up. So I was very surprised to see all these people that I knew. Right.
That you knew. Did
Yeah.
you ever talk one on one with Kearney, or do you just he was around the
I
area?
just saw Kearney. I mean, he's a busy
Yeah.
guy. He's a
Yeah.
company commander. He's doing his
Sure.
thing. I saw Osland yelled at me in the gym once. Well, he didn't. He didn't yell at me. So we were overseas. My buddy and I, Jose, were exercising, and like I don't remember what we were doing, but again, this comes back like to the Ranger and standards, right? So we're in our PTs, and at least at the time, like we still tucked our t-shirt into our PT shorts.
Yeah.
Well, whatever exercise we were doing, it was more convenient for us to be untucked for whatever reason. Maybe it's just because the shirt would come untucked anyways or whatever.
Yeah.
So we were just minding our own business, and I'm not throwing shade at Austin. It's fine. But
Yeah.
but but we've got our shirts untucked. We're minding our business. We're exercising. He comes over. He was actually he could have been an ass about it because that's sort of a Ranger way. But he said, "Hey gentlemen, hey, let's make sure we tuck in those t-shirts. Let's be the leaders. Let's remember that people are watching us, and we need to be the leaders. And set the example." We were like we were like, yeah, Roger that, sir. And we tucked in our t-shirts and we kept going on. We're like, okay. So he's like he was an old school dude, and that's
Yeah.
just the way it was. So I didn't have any heartburn about it, but yeah, I did talk to Oslo.
Yeah.
uh,
Kearney, yeah, Kearney seemed like a tough dude. I mean, watching him on patrol a little bit, just some clips here and there from Restrepo. But he was no slouch. I mean, he was like, let's go give it to these guys. I mean, he seemed like a great leader in that sense.
I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a guy given I mean, we've just
Uh,
established an impossible mission. Mission impossible. Hey, Kearney, take your company and try to make sense out of the deadliest valley in Afghanistan.
Right.
Um, like make these people who don't want our help accept our help, and try to minimize casualties, and try to be, by the way, oh by the way, an infantry company commander, and like kill the enemy too, because
Right.
you know if we forgot about that part, like you're an infantry company commander. So yeah, he seems like a guy who, I don't know. I can't say whether he did a good job or a bad job. But I'll definitely say that he had a tough mission, a lot of stuff on his shoulders, and it's hard to judge a person who's in a position like that, because it's just him. He was the CEO, he was the company commander, he was the dude in charge.
And that's relatively young, man, to be
Extremely young.
like
He had to have been, he
yeah,
was mid-20s
right,
at the
right.
max.
A captain, yeah,
Yeah, like he was like 26 or something
right.
when
Maybe.
he's in that. Yeah.
He also had a sense of humor, although like a lot of combat uh humor, it's dark humor. He was being asked by an elder. They would have these meetings with these tribal elders, and they were sitting there, and this one the interpreter told this Afghan elder is asking him why did you detain Muhammad Yusuf? And he said, "Who the fuck is that?" And the interpreter said something. And he whispered, an advisor whispered in his ear. He just turned around to the elder and goes, "Because I saw him cut two people's heads off." He's like wanting one of their boys back, and like that's the crazy thing. I mean, this is a brutal terrorist who's just doing the unimaginable, and yet it's like, well, can we have him back? And all this back and forth. It's insane in some ways. But I could tell Kearney had
I mean, he's definitely a guy who is he's his cup of bullshit hath runneth over,
right.
and like you're just
Yeah.
getting raw Kearney.
Yeah.
You're
Oh
just
man.
it's just raw. He's doing his job, he's trying his best, and you're getting what you're getting.
Yeah.
So you definitely see that, and you can understand that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well, the wow, I was just looking at our time here. Yeah, I was gonna maybe turn the page. Um some of the well, one thing we can talk about, the firefights, the what I sense from these guys, and the seriousness of the firefights they were in, like close proximity in some cases, where I mean they could hear, like in Rock Avalanche, one of their ops, they boy, these guys were coming over real close, trying to get a body, and take it into custody. It's just a wonder they didn't get him, because they just had every disadvantage. Our guys had every disadvantage in this case, but those real intense firefights, then also, like Patrick said, being on their heels. If they're out on patrol, they're just thinking, I pray I'd get through this. And they were always thinking, well, I'm going to be the next guy. I'm going to be the next guy dead. How can you not think about your mind is like, well, and what I'm kind of rambling, but I'm going to come back here. One of the toughest guys, a sergeant, staff sergeant named Rugal, was shot in the head and killed instantly. And a lot of them broke down. They lost their shit when that happened, because he apparently, like they said, he was one of, if not the toughest fighter in that entire company. I mean, he was really hardened, real serious. I could tell by pictures of him before he was killed. He didn't have a lot of time for bullshit either. You could see it on his face. He was ready to go get him. And so when he was killed, it was like, it sets up this weird psychological trauma of, if one of the best, toughest dudes just got waxed like that, what chance do I have, for a less experienced guy or a new guy or something like that? And but those are some pieces, but then being, just being in a place that's really, I mean, there were places where, because of the mountains, when they're at OP Restrepo, they could just lob rounds in on them from higher elevations, and mortars sometimes, occasionally. So it was like you could just be walking from, the pisser back to your rack, and boom, could conceivably be shot just walking across the OP. So they were there was a he made a connection, Younger did, with how guys, with the climax, the incredible climax, and you could see it in a couple scenes. There's this one particular scene in Restrepo. I think it's good to watch both the documentary Restrepo and read the book, because a lot more content in the book, but you can really get a sense of the visceral tension in the air. Well, they had just it came under fire at Restrepo, and they returned fire and actually did really well. I think they took a couple people out. I think the helicopters, they call it gunmetal, that was the Apaches. They came in and were able to clear the situation, and they pretty much turned the tide. And they were just really excited. They were high-fiving and giddy and like, yo, bro, I can't believe that. It was awesome and all this. And it was this extreme climactic tension, and then this fall into, and it was right after one of those firefights. They asked one of the guys, I can't remember which one, they said, so how are you going to adjust to civilian life after this? And he just looked and he goes, I have no idea. Because while it was horrifying on one level, it was like extremely exhilarating. And I've tasted a little bit of that, nothing on like these guys had faced, but where it is an adrenaline rush. That's the bottom line. And I've always said, after jumping out of planes and free falling and spy rigs, and I'm like, I'm ruined for amusement parks. I used to love them, and I still kind of do, but it's nothing like some of the rushes you get. Well, that's just an analogous way to say there. I don't know what the follow-up is with some of these guys, but I know he made the connection. Younger made the connection of how getting so used to that kind of high is going to be problematic in a lot of areas of trying to come back to normal life, especially in just sexual intimacy with a partner, like, because the extreme of that adrenaline, they said it was like orgasmic. I think one of them used that term. So I don't know where I'm going with it all, but just to see the tension that results in some just the firefight life. Just how are they gonna reconnect with any kind of normalcy? I don't know.
Yeah, I think, maybe it's even due for a like a follow-up of some way somehow, you know.
Yeah.
Maybe that's something he's been, and I know he's put out some more books since then. Well, we're out of time here. We'll pick it back up in the next episode. So thanks for listening. We'll catch you in the next one.